here for this panel to talk about healthy aging, which is a topic that I'm personally interested in. I have my mother living with me and my mother-in-law also here going through various health issues, so I'm really interested in what all our panelists have to say. Raj, I wanted to start off with you in terms of just a global perspective, given the results of this report, and the sort of interesting findings about, especially in certain places in India and elsewhere, where older people are happier and older women are happier, and trying to get a sense of, can you connect the dots in terms of factors that are part of all of these results, or is it different in terms of the cultural and economic factors of these various places?
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. I'd start by saying you're interested in aging. I think, population aging is really the story of our lives along with climate change and our children's lives. And so I think we have no choice but to recognize the impact that aging societies are having around the world. Some are aging faster, some are already super aging societies, some just have a longer runway to develop their internal infrastructure to handle the growing number of older adults that are coming. And so I think when we talk about well-being, when we talk about happiness around the world, we have to kind of disconnect the medicalization of our lives to kind of the culture and the environment that we live in. I think population health around the world has really done a tremendous job in terms of doubling life expectancy over the last century. But with longer lives, with the growing number of older adults, that creates challenges also for societies. And I don't think that healthcare infrastructure in the US or around the world will ever really get to the point of maturity, of capacity, where it'll be able to handle the number of health conditions that will arise as we get older. There's a statistic that says, by the time you turn 65, 80% of 65-year-olds have a chronic condition. By the time you turn 70, that goes up to 95%. So we will all, have some chronic condition or more, 2 chronic conditions, by the time we get into kind of those later stages of life. And so I think we need to look beyond our healthcare system. I think we need to take a deeper look into the environment in which we live in, the cities that we live in, to really manage the external stressors that are placed on us on a daily basis. I think our environment, our culture really help to address things like loneliness, which has come up a number of times. In Asian countries, which you mentioned, are starting to see an increase in happiness as we get older. There's the concept of filial piety, where the younger kids within families take it as their responsibility to look after their parents or grandparents, and joint families are very common. And I think that does a lot in terms of exalting older adults to this position of reverence, to this position of leadership, gives them purpose, gives financial security for them as they get older. But also from a younger generation, it destigmatizes getting older. It reduces the fear of older adults. Excuse me. And so I think, that level of intergenerational connections that we see in, a lot of the Asian countries has a protective shield, for both younger and older adults. So I think that environment, the cities, all the factors outside of our healthcare system are the points that will really not only increase longevity moving forward, but also kind of add meaning to those additional years.
Right. And Emily, in terms of the demographic changes that Raj was mentioning, particularly when it comes to certain health conditions such as dementia, I think you talked about previously with some of my colleagues that the number of people who are going to have dementia are going to double by 2050. What does that mean for the happiness, not just for them, but on their families, their their friends, where, I've seen, like, my mother-in-law move from a place where she was for decades, had a support system, now she's here, and it's really changed her cognitive abilities, and you can see it's how much of a difference a community makes. So can you just talk about those demographic shifts and what that means for our society?
Yeah, absolutely. So the World Health Organization estimates that by the year 2050, the number of older adults over the age of 60 will double, and the number of older adults over the age of 80 will triple. Meanwhile, we know that age is the single biggest risk factor for dementia. And although there are some early promising biomedical treatments, right now there is no cure for dementia. So as the global population ages, we can expect that the number of people living with dementia is also going to increase. And dementia can have really profound consequences for the well-being and quality of life of the individual, but also their families. And so as we see more worldwide dementia cases, this is going to be an increasingly pressing public health issue in terms of care for individuals with dementia, but also an increasingly prevalent personal issue for many families and communities around the world. And so where happiness and well-being comes into this picture, I think, is twofold. On the one hand, we can think of happiness and well-being as a protective tool that we can leverage to reduce dementia prevalence and prevent some dementia cases. So a growing body of evidence suggests that people with higher levels of happiness and well-being are actually less likely to develop dementia and can even better tolerate the neuropathology, the underlying disease processes that cause dementia. And so what this means is if we invest in well-being and happiness of our communities, of our societies, we may be able to help mitigate that increase in dementia prevalence that we are anticipating. The other place that I think this comes in is when we're thinking about how our societies, our healthcare systems, our families can better support individuals living with dementia. I think it's important to keep well-being and happiness as one of our outcomes of interest. Although dementia can be really devastating for individuals and their families, it's also possible to live well with dementia. And if we're tracking and measuring and assessing whether different care environments, different healthcare strategies can support the well-being both of the individual living with dementia and then also of their care partners, whether that's their family or whether that's healthcare professionals, to really create systems that can have longevity and that are sustainable.
So that's really interesting because, when we go to checkups, you're talking to doctors, as mentioned, I've been dealing with this. It is talked about in very sort of clinical terms sometimes, and the sort of quality of your life, your happiness is not really discussed as much in some of these conversations. So how can that become a bigger sort of part of the conversation and understanding that actually does play a significant role?
Yeah, so I think there's two pieces here. One is just public education of the importance of happiness and well-being, not just for how we feel, but also for our physical health and longevity. Just talking about it more in forums like this so that individuals are educated about the importance of their own mental health, and maybe that will help people to feel empowered to really work to put their mental health first. But then also within our healthcare systems, I think it's important to start formally assessing mental health, well-being, happiness across the lifespan, because that can be a really important indicator of someone's overall health and their future health trajectory.
And Russ, what does this mean for policymakers, not only, as Emily was talking about, with our healthcare system, but also just our workforce, the people who might need to take time off of work to care for an elderly relative or friend and have a sort of healthy aging momentum for societies?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. Thanks for asking. Thanks to the Gallup organization and everybody for thinking about older folks in this setting. It's not something that's often done, but it is a huge issue for our time, and I appreciate the conversation. On a policy level, the last panel that you did also talked about sort of environmental factors. There's only so much any individual can do, whether it's talking to their doctor or whether it's talking with their family members. there really is a policy environment, and it goes to countries, it goes to states and localities. Your report talks about dementia villages. There's lots of different, people live in an environment. And lots of different factors play in. There's really interesting research, some of which was cited in the report, on the effect of racism on people's happiness, and then the risk of dementia. And it changes the brain to experience racism. So more than like sort of simple, oh, we ought to give people time off, which we ought to do, more than simple policy interventions sort of affect this whole trajectory. It's the system in which people live. Paid time off is really important. And in the US, we don't do a very good job of that. Emily mentioned and you mentioned actually from your personal experience, the care partner. One thing we know about dementia is that there's never just one person. By the time someone starts to lose their independence, I mean, the definition of dementia is the loss of independence. So when someone starts to lose their independence, they've got to have someone, and then that person starts to have health issues. So we also have to think about the health issues and well-being of the caregiver.
Ooh, can I just,
Yes.
Caregivers are predominantly women, and so they say, living well with dementia, requires you to have a daughter at home to take care of, the person, which also puts women at higher risk for developing dementia. And I think, acknowledging kind of the social justice aspect of placing, a lot of this onto the women of households has tremendous impacts throughout, their life course. A lot of women have to leave the workforce. It reduces savings for their retirement. They outlive their husbands a lot of times, so it places them in precarious positions. And I think, there's statistics that say that unpaid caregiving, there's 18.5 billion hours of unpaid caregiving, predominantly, supplied by women. And those numbers and the financial outcome of those are not really acknowledged in kind of the budgetary numbers that we hear about. And I think, more needs to go into kind of providing that support, paying caregivers. There's a lot of policy levers that can help.
Sure,
with that.
yeah. Well, and for a lot of women, they're caring for their children on one end and elderly parents on the other. On the more happier spectrum, for those countries and places where we have seen the happiness factor actually increase with age, what are the lessons learned for the future for them? Because, you talk about some of the cultural factors in Eastern countries, and, I see that as well from my own perspective of having family around you, someone taking care of you. It's just kind of ingrained in the system. But that's changing as well in these societies where, it's not always automatic now that if you're elderly, you're not going to automatically go live with your oldest child and just be part of that family going forward. So how do you see the future trajectory of some of these places that do have higher happiness levels now, and if that could change in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, community is going to play such an important role for older adults. There's a trend towards having older adults age in their home, which is their preference for them, but also for policymakers, to try and keep them engaged in the community as much as possible. It will be interesting seeing trends 20, 30 years from now as, demographics change, as children in the household maybe work, further and further away from the home. But I think, the idea of community, you mentioned your mom has moved down with you. I'm on the other side of the spectrum. My dad, lives alone in Pittsburgh, but chooses to stay in the community where he has 40-year relationships with everybody there. They've immigrated together, they've gone through every life stage together, and they're at the point, where that investment in the community over the past 40 years is paying off, and it provides the support that they need. And I think, around the world, that idea of dementia-friendly communities, there's a great example in Japan. I don't know if anyone's heard about the restaurant of mistaken orders in Japan, which is staffed by people with dementia. And, it's a great kind of example of the community embracing all of the folks, giving opportunities and purpose, expanding awareness for the rest of the community so that there's not as much fear and stigma associated with this. I looked up the reviews of that right before this to see how harsh people are. It's 4 out of 5 stars for the restaurant. But there's examples of that in London where they have the slow checkout lane for older adults where the cashiers are trained to have conversations with folks, and it's meant to create more of an engagement opportunity. And so I think that there's so much opportunity for communities, for businesses, who can realize, a value economically of catering to older adults and kind of empowering people through
I think
Russ, we're almost out of time, but I want to let you get in the last word.
Thank you.
Yes.
I mean, it's sort of inherent in your question was, well, cultures might change for the worse. But inherent in this whole report and inherent in the panel that we're talking about, whether it's on an individual level or a societal level, there are things we can do. We learned that there are things we can do at an individual level to reduce your risk of dementia. There are things you can do to age more healthily. And there's also policy and cultural things that can be done. Talking about it today is a really good thing. We all have to sort of think about what can be done, whether it's the examples Raj gave or anything else. It's not inevitable unless we don't act.
Great. Well, and on that happy note, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.